Hi guys, a long time no see, and I'm sorry that this video has to be about something that most people have already addressed multiple times, the resurrection story of Yeshua. Now, you've heard the old tired arguments. What you've not heard are some obvious questions you could ask to see if the story even is worth considering seriously. What we do know so far is that the earliest account of Yeshua even existing is from Paul. Some might say Luke, some might say Matthew, but the earliest is dated 50 AD. And Yeshua, if he died under Pilate, as according to the stories, would be at latest 36. So already you got a 14-year gap between the day he died and the first written account of him even existing. Okay? Leave aside the fact we're not sure what year he was born and how old he was when he died. We have right now a 14-year gap between the day he died and the first written account of him even existing. Let's look at Paul first. Paul is our favorite. Why? Because he's allegedly the hostile witness, the person who was persecuting Christians and then became a Christian himself. And he's also a nice one because he's said to have written the earliest account of Yeshua existing. If we were to look at Paul as the best evidence for Yeshua existing and or resurrecting, here are some problems. First of all, we have nothing other than Paul's word to go by that he didn't essentially create the story himself. I'm not saying he did. I'm saying we have nothing else to go by that Yeshua existed and the tradition and story of Yeshua existed prior to Paul. We have Paul telling us, he appeared to me, and I am passing on what was given to me. We have no idea what those things are or where they came from. So far we have his word. Paul persecuted Christians. That, again, is according to his word. Paul said himself that I used to persecute Christians and now I'm a Christian. So we're just going to take his word for it, right? The empty tomb, I'm sorry, I changed the subject. Now we're not talking about Paul anymore. But when people cite Paul, they're basically saying he was a hostile witness that turned into a Christian. But that's according to himself. And he was the earliest written account of Yeshua even existing. Now we'll change the subject. When we're talking about Matthew, who actually talks about the empty tomb, we are told that we have to reconcile or explain the alleged story of why there was an empty tomb, or why there were witnesses, according to Paul. Why are we asked to explain a story that somebody else told? Because when you really have to ask, the story becomes this. I was abducted by aliens. And how do you explain what happened if I told you I was abducted by aliens? Because if I wasn't abducted by aliens, why would I tell you that I was abducted by aliens? I don't at least point to, maybe there's a crop circle in my yard, maybe I was gone for many hours, maybe there's a scar on my body. You have my word, and I'm asking you, how do you explain my story of me being abducted by aliens unless I was abducted by aliens? We have no other evidence other than the biblical accounts. That is, the four Gospels and Paul. And that's very generous because most people readily admit that the four Gospels are essentially two sources. But I'll give you 5 accounts. We have nothing outside of the 5 accounts, at least none that came at the same time. Only ones that came after that mention the resurrection or Jesus or anything along those lines. We are asked to explain why the Gospels mention a supernatural event if it didn't happen. Why? Who applies the standard anywhere else? Why am I asked to explain a story that I didn't tell? It is one thing if a Roman or Jewish historian at the time, not after, said that, well, there was a guy named Yeshua. We can't explain this and that, but we know he existed at the time while he was alive. Or shortly after, not getting it from the believers, the disciples, the apostles. If we were not to take the four Gospels and Paul directly as face value and as fact, there is no explaining we have to do. That's the problem, dude. In other words, when we're asked to explain, well, what else happened if it wasn't the resurrection story? It is only after you've accepted these accounts. There is no explaining to do if you did not. There's nothing else that contradicts reality or history from the Romans or the Jews or whoever was living in Palestine at the time, if you didn't take the Gospels as fact to begin with. So when you're asked to explain what else could have happened if not the resurrection, you're basically apologizing for a story you never told and you were never forced to accept in the first place. You're basically, at most, trying to make an internal consistency of a story that nobody else buys. That's it. So, if you don't buy the resurrection story, explain to me why somebody else... No. If you don't buy the resurrection story, explain to me why somebody wrote the resurrection story. That's the question.